This lecture is about how the Quran was interpreted in the early and classical periods. We will not cover the modern period in this lecture. In this lecture, we will cover a number of things. First, we will look at how the early phase of Quranic interpretation was and how interpretation took place just after Prophet Muhammad's death, when he was no longer there to interpret the revelation himself. Then we will move to the classical phase, which occurred during the height of the intellectually important period of Islamic civilization, which is roughly from around 250 years or so after the Prophet's death. Finally, we will explore the issue of whether interpretation should be based on tradition, that is, the Quran, the Sunnah, and the earliest Muslims' views, in short, the past, or it should be based also on reason. The question for us is, why do we need to interpret at all? When we look at some texts from the Quran, sometimes it's not all that clear what the meaning of a particular word or phrase is. There may be a Quranic passage that alludes to something in the past, say during the Prophet's time. So context is sometimes required for understanding that text and of course for interpretation. At other times, there may be verses from the Quran that seem to contradict each other. Different verses putting forward different positions, for example. This requires a resolution one way or another. There may be layers of meaning that may not be apparent when we look at the text at a fairly basic linguistic level. Also, when we move away from the time of the revelation to any other period outside the original context, the interpreter stands in a very different environment. So there needs to be some process of reconciliation between the Quranic text and what we are dealing with and the context. Interpretation of the legal verses, that is, law related verses of the Quran, poses particular challenges because it involves laws, rules, and regulations. Interpreters need to draw on certain specific tools in this process, like the principles of jurisprudence, which covers principles dealing with language, meaning, interpretation, methods, and tools for interpretation of such legal texts. In this subject, we have come across concepts like abrogation, or in Arabic, naskh, N-A-S-K-H, or analogical reasoning, or qiyas, Q-I-Y-A-S. There are, of course, many others. In most cases, a legal ruling involves more than simply reading the text of the Quran and having a basic understanding of it. There are lots of tools and methods and principles involved in such interpretation. Let us now look at the early phase of Quranic interpretation, that is, after the Prophet's death. What do we mean by early phase? The early phase of Quranic interpretation is really about the first 2 centuries or so after the Prophet Muhammad died in 632. One key feature of this phase is that, generally speaking, there are no manuscripts of Quranic commentaries or interpretation from this time. There are very early Quran manuscripts, but I'm talking about Quran manuscripts, not Quranic interpretation. One Quranic manuscript found very recently has been dated very early to almost the Prophet's time. But in terms of Quranic interpretations or commentaries, what we have with us now is largely orally transmitted material from one teacher to his student and so forth. Or what we have is material that may have been transmitted in writing of some sort, but we no longer have the original documents. We can find traces of such early material in later Quran commentaries dating from around the 3rd century of Islam, but the originals have been lost. So it is difficult to say a lot about this period of interpretation. The materials on Quranic interpretation that we have for this early period, that is the first 200 years or so after the death of the Prophet, are believed to have been the product of teachers, some of whom had great authority in places like Medina, Mecca, Damascus, Kufa, Baghdad, and the like. A second source that produced such material is the storytelling preachers who moved around in the Arab Muslim caliphate or empire from town to town, following the Muslim communities who were a minority living outside Arabia at the time. Many of these storytelling preachers went from the heartland of Islam, that is Arabia, into areas such as Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. The early settlers of these areas from Arabia were soldiers who had taken part in the Muslim conquests in the 7th century of the Common Era. They and their children and the children of their children and so forth were largely cut off from the learning that was available in places like Mecca and Medina about the Qur'an. As time went on, in the first 2 centuries of Islam, Islamic knowledge became widespread, with many teachers and students. Debates on various Islamic issues continued. Generally, different schools of thought in Islam emerged: legal schools, theological schools, and the like. In the area of Quranic interpretation, the teachings were clearly linked to a chain of authority of scholars going back to the earliest Muslims, while others were linked to storytelling preachers who elaborated on the narratives and stories of the Quran. Let us look briefly at one of the most well-known commentaries on the Quran, that is Tabari's commentary. Tabari's commentary is example of a later collection of a lot of material on Quranic interpretation. We should say perhaps it is one of the most famous. His death date or year is roughly 300 years or so after the Prophet. Tabari's commentary is one of the earliest compilations of the interpretation of the Quran that puts together a vast array of material that existed on interpretation of the Quran by his time. That is, Tabari put together the accumulated knowledge on the Quran by his time. Tabari collected something like 30 narrations or traditions or anecdotes or reports that were relevant to explaining the meanings of the Quran. He used them to interpret the Quran from the beginning to the end, verse by verse. His book of interpretation or commentary or Tafsir in Arabic, Tafsir, has different editions, and some editions have over 20 volumes. This and other similar commentaries are enormous works. For this reason, most have not been translated into English or any other language. They remain in Arabic. Only the first volume of Tabari's Quran commentary has been translated. For the non-specialist, it may not be easy to read. Let us look at an example of a narration or tradition or a report or an anecdote about a Quranic verse. What we have here is such an example of a narration or a report. This is part of Tabari's attempts at explaining the very first verse of the Quran, chapter 1, verse 1. And Tabari says, and he's reporting this particular narration or report. He says, Abu Quraib narrated to us, meaning Tabari, that Usman ibn Sa'id narrated, that Bishr ibn Umara narrated, that Abu Rawq said from Ad-Dahhak, that Ibn Abbas said. Ibn Abbas died in Islamic calendar in the year 68, in the Christian calendar 687. The actual text of the report is this. The first time Gabriel, that is angel Gabriel, was sent down to Muhammad, he, meaning the angel, said, O Muhammad, say, I seek refuge from Satan, the rejected, in the all-hearing, the all-knowing. This is what Muslims begin with when they start reading the Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. The report goes on to say, then he said, meaning the angel said, say, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Gabriel said to him, meaning the Prophet, speak by the name of God, Muhammad, as if to say, recite with the invocation of God, your Lord, and stand and sit with the invocation of God. Here, Tabari is trying to explain the very beginning of the Quran. In fact, for him, this is the very first revelation of the Quran. That is, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, which is the very first verse written in the Quran. A key aspect of such a report or a narration is that it has two parts. Let us look at the very first part of the narration, which is what we call the chain of transmission. As you can see between Tabari here and the person who is saying this, that is Ibn Abbas, one of the companions of the Prophet, there are several people in the chain. The technical term for this chain of transmission is isnad, I-S-N-A-D. The second part of the narration or report is what we call matn, M-A-T-N in Arabic. It is the actual text of the report. So that such a text would have two parts, the chain of transmission and actual text. So in this actual text, that's the second part, we have a report about something that happened to the Prophet. Here we have a mention of the first time the angel Gabriel was sent down to Prophet Muhammad, according to this report. In an earlier lecture, we looked at the very first revelation the Prophet received. At the time, we said that it is chapter 96, verses 1 to 5. This report or narration we are looking at now is a standard alone piece of narration or information, and it doesn't give any kind of context as to how it stands in relation to chapter 96, verses 1 to 5, where Gabriel teaches Prophet Muhammad to read in the name of your Lord who created, and so forth. When deciding on which verse was first revealed, scholars have to look at all these different narrations or reports and come to an understanding. The point is that all these narrations exist independently of each other. So you need to put them together into a narrative of some sort and have them sit alongside others to make sense of them. Let us look at what we refer to as occasions of the revelation, or in Arabic, Asbab al-nuzul. The occasions of revelation, or Asbab al-nuzul, are texts or reports or narrations that claim to describe the circumstances that led to the revelation of a particular Quranic verse or verses. You can find a lot of them in various commentaries on the Quran. Ibn Abbas, we met just a short while ago, is an important figure in these texts or narrations on Asbab Nuzul or occasions of revelation. Ibn Abbas was a first generation Muslim, in fact, the most prominent of the early witnesses to the Quran and context related information. He was actually a young boy when the Prophet died, roughly 13 years old. Ibn Abbas was the Prophet's cousin, the son of the Prophet's uncle Abbas, who is a very famous figure in Islamic history. Ibn Abbas was not the only one, but many other early figures have provided such reports or narrations. But he is an important figure, in fact, one of the very important figures, because there are so many traditions attributed to him. And he becomes more or less like the teacher on these matters in early Islam, obviously after the Prophet and some other senior companions. These early narrations or reports about the Quran that refer to the meaning of various texts of the Quran or provide the occasions of revelation are generally quite different to those you would find in the famous Bukhari's hadith collection in terms of the degree of reliability of such reports. Many scholars would say that many of the traditions of the Prophet or reports attributed to various companions of the Prophet found in Quran commentaries may not necessarily be very reliable compared to the traditions in Hadith collection like that of Bukhari or the collector whose name is Muslim. In the commentaries, you will find lots of texts about the occasions of the revelation. The commentators were less interested in actually identifying the reason why this verse or that verse was revealed. They were more interested in being curators of the tradition. They wanted to preserve what was available and what was circulating. They would collect all the available material that existed at the time to preserve that material. Sometimes they would express an opinion as to whether they thought one view was more likely than others, but often they only provided a list of such occasions or reports for a particular verse without giving any preference. Let us look at an example to illustrate this. Again, we look at Tabari's commentary. Here, Tabari is trying to give us a sense of chapter 2, verse 115, and some of it is related to the occasion of the revelation. And sometimes these reports are about explaining what the verse may mean. The verse says, "To God belong the east and the west. Wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. Verily, God is all-encompassing, all-wise." This is what Tabari provides us with. Again, I'm summarizing here. He has a number of views attributed to different early figures. The first is Ibn Abbas, died 68 of the Islamic calendar, and As-Suddi died 127. They say this verse is a response to the Jews' question, that is the Jews in Medina, in chapter 2 verse 142. This verse says, "What has turned them," meaning the Muslims, "from the direction they used to face their prayers?" Previously, Muslims were facing Jerusalem, and later they were asked to face Medina. So Ibn Abbas and Asuddi are saying this verse is actually a response to the question coming from the Jews in Medina. Qatada, another early Muslim, died 117, says, "It meant Muslims could face any direction to pray before verse 2, chapter 2, verse 149 was revealed." And another figure, Zayd ibn Aslam, died 136, says, "It was revealed, then the Prophet commanded people to pray to Jerusalem." The figure, Ibn Umar, died 132, says, "Voluntary prayers can be performed in any direction when mounted on a horse, for example." Another figure, Rabi'a, died 80, says, "It was revealed to excuse the Prophet when he prayed in the wrong direction one dark night." Finally, Qatada, again another early Muslim, says, "It was revealed when the Christian king of Abyssinia died and the Prophet commanded Muslims to pray for him." As you can see, there are several traditions attributed to different early figures of Islam in relation to the occasion of the revelation of this verse or about the meaning of the verse. Most of these figures belong to the second or third generation. So there isn't really a link between them and those who lived during the Prophet's generation, or there's no direct link. Most are not necessarily eyewitness accounts from the time of the Prophet. They are very different in terms of what they say about the revelation or the occasion of the revelation. What this shows is that there may be many different reasons or occasions mentioned for a particular verse of the Quran. We are not quite sure which is the right one. They are all different opinions or views. Quite a few of these reports refer to the direction of the prayer. But as you can see, the verse does not say anything about prayer directly. It says, "Wherever you turn, there is the face of God." It seems to be quite a theological verse, rather than specifically about the ritual or the prayer, or in Arabic, salat. But the other key thing to note is that all of these explanations have a concrete story. They are not speculative. They are saying this is the story of what happened. In the commentaries, you will find commentators have tried to put together whatever was available to them as far as the occasions of the revelation were concerned. This means that some traditions about the occasions of the revelation may not be strictly historical, but at least they shed some light on the thinking of the early commentators, who saw their role as preserving and compiling the tradition. Let us look at this issue of presence of Christian and Jewish traditions in Quran commentaries. Another key issue to note is that the early commentators on the Quran had no particular problem in integrating elements of Jewish or Christian traditions in their explanations of various Quranic verses. Often this is about filling in the details or the gaps in the stories the Quran covers very briefly. For example, the story of Adam and Eve in the Quran is very brief. It does not provide much detail. Eve's name is not even mentioned. There is no reference to Eve being created from Adam's rib, for example. There is no serpent. There is no particular mention of Eve to be blamed. In commentaries like that of Tabari, you will find a lot more detail about this story, some of which comes from the early commentators. But much of the detail comes from Jewish and Christian traditions. The name of Eve is mentioned in the commentaries, as is creation from Adam's rib and reference to the serpent. These are not in the Quran. Early on, people were quite comfortable using these details as a basis for explaining the meanings of various parts of the Quran, particularly Quranic stories. Later in the tradition of Quranic interpretation, a few centuries later, in fact, we find more suspicion about these narratives, the Jewish and Christian narratives, perhaps as a way of boundary setting between different faiths. One objective, if you like, of any commentary is to resolve problems in the text, like something that is ambiguous. The story of Iblis, Iblis, in the Quran is one example of this kind of ambiguity. Iblis is generally considered one of the angels or one of the jinn, Jinn. The story of Adam, in a much shorter version, says he, meaning Iblis, was one of the jinn. This is in the Quran. Well, who are the jinn? Muslims believe the jinn are created like human beings, but they are not visible to humans. They do exist, but they're not visible. Like humans, the jinn are supposed to be believers in God and non-believers. If we go back to the story of Adam, in addition to the verse that says Iblis was one of the jinn, we have another Quranic verse that says, we, meaning God, said to the angels to prostrate before Adam. They all prostrated except Iblis. In chapter 2, where the Adam's story is elaborated on, it doesn't say Iblis was one of the jinn. It just says the angels all prostrated except Iblis. There is also another passage where Iblis himself says to God, you, meaning God, created him, Adam, from clay and created me from fire. So I, meaning Iblis, I am not going to prostrate to him. So the question is, was Iblis an angel or one of the jinn? In explaining this issue, classical commentators analyzed the text by looking at the grammar of the text, the linguistic aspects of the text. Based on this linguistic analysis, some commentators argued that Iblis was in fact a jinn or part of jinn, not an angel. And some would say he was originally an angel or he was an angel. When we look at a commentary, for example, that of Tabari, You can see a wide range of narratives, reports, and comments by different people who are trying to explain whether Iblis was a jinn or an angel. They all depend on how interpreters understood the various references to Iblis in the Quran and the kinds of stories and reports that came from the key figures of early Islam. What this shows is that commentators used many ways to understand a text, a Quranic text, a phrase or a word, not just relying on the linguistic meaning of a particular word or phrase. In short, in the early phase of the Quran, Quranic interpretation was developing and not fully systematized. A lot of focus was on explaining particular words or phrases of the Quran, or on making sense of particular verses by referring to what appeared to be occasions of revelation, or explanation of particular references in the Quran by relying on Jewish or Christian narratives, and finally on explanation of legal verses of the Quran. Let us now look at the classical period. So after the early phase, or the first 250 years or so after the death of the Prophet, we move to the classical period. This is the period when the center of the Muslim caliphate or empire was moved to Baghdad in Iraq. In this period, there's a real growth in scientific knowledge as well as various areas of Islamic knowledge. There was the translation movement, which brought scientific and philosophical works from the Greeks, the Persians, and the Indians into Arabic language. There was the influence of rational thought, Aristotelian logic, and so forth. There was greater sophistication in the development of the Arabic grammatical and linguistic disciplines. There was the discipline of disputation or dialectics, or what we call theology, because it involved debates about the nature of God or other theological questions, such as free will and predestination. There was also law and legal thought. All of these became later independent disciplines with their own formal rules and methods and concepts and frameworks. Quranic interpretation as a separate discipline developed also as part of this. So we are talking about a very important and creative period of Islamic history. So how did the classical scholars treat the early tradition? In the classical period, interpreters of the Quran generally tended to integrate the early explanations of Quranic verses and commentaries. They didn't just go off in their own direction. However, not everyone was comfortable with all the narrations or reports from this early era. For example, one hadith scholar, the famous Ahmad ibn Hanbal, one of the key figures associated with Hanbali school of law, said three things have no basis for him: Tafsir or Quranic commentary, stories of the Prophet's battles, and the stories about the end of times or end of the world. There's no additional information about what he meant by this, but these are the three areas about which he generally spoke. The question for him was the reliability of the material in these fields of knowledge. Let us not forget that Ahmad bin Hanbal was a great collector of hadith, and this may have influenced his view of the material in these disciplines. Many interpreters of the Quran also expressed doubt about these stories that had a Jewish or Christian origin. However, they didn't throw them out. The point of the tradition was to collect everything and have that available for scholars. Let us now look at this issue of theology in Quranic interpretation. Now, some of the issues the classical commentators on the Quran were particularly interested include anthropomorphic verses, the issue of predestination and free will, depiction of prophets, createdness of the Quran, whether the Quran was created or not, and some political issues such as leadership of the community. The commentators had to work out how to apply theological ideas in their Quranic interpretation. For example, how to understand the anthropomorphic verses of the Quran. Did God actually have human attributes? There was also theological issues about predestination and free will, and how the prophets were depicted in the Quran. For example, Abraham smashing the idols and then telling a lie to the people. Telling a lie is the big issue. Theologically, how was this reconciled? This was a theological issue because it relates to the doctrine of the infallibility of the prophets. This means prophets do not commit such sins. Another theological issue was whether the Quran was created or was it eternally with God all times as one of his attributes, meaning God's attributes, that is the Quran as speech of God. Political issues such as leadership of the Muslim community were also explored, like who was supposed to be the rightful successor to the Prophet, and how should people respond to civil wars that went on among Muslims in the first century of Islam, for example. All of these issues affected Quranic interpretation. As I said, Greek logic also influenced interpretation, and increasingly apologetics, as Muslims disputed with Christians about the nature of the Quran and the nature of Jesus Christ. Was the Quran the word of God or not? What about Jesus? Was he word of God? How does one interpret the Quranic reference to Jesus as word? What does that mean? There were many sophisticated arguments between Greek philosophy trained Muslim scholars and Christian Arab theologians, even in the caliphal court in Baghdad, around such theological issues. So let us look at the various groups or key groups in Islamic theology. In this period, there are three key groups to be aware of as far as theology is concerned. One group which preferred to focus on narrations or traditions transmitted by early Muslims is usually called the traditionists. That is, from the tradition meaning a report, hadith, or a saying attributed to the Prophet, or in some cases to a companion of the Prophet. A traditionist is a person who follows traditions or hadith. Even though most commentators of the Quran were actually traditionist in a way because of their broader sense of looking backwards and relying on what was said before. This group tended to accept what was present in a hadith or a report or a narration. By this group, the traditionists. They did not tend to apply logic or any other form of rational thought to the text or to the hadith or to the report to make it more acceptable, intellectually perhaps, or theologically. They basically just accepted the text as it was without necessarily inquiring into it. The attitude was, by and large, to accept the tradition or the report or the hadith rather than questioning it. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the Mu'tazilis or Mu'tazila, a very early important school of theology in Islam. Rationalist is the best way to describe them, perhaps strongly influenced by Greek thought. If there was a problem in the Quran in terms of a text that didn't seem to fit or difficult to come to terms with, their tendency was to interpret it metaphorically so that it did fit. For example, if there is a Quranic verse that makes reference to God's hand or face, they simply could not take it literally. They just simply interpreted that metaphorically. Finally, there were the Ash'aris. The founder of this school, Ash'ari, was a scholar who was trained in the rational methods and disputation among the Mu'tazilis, but he had a later change of heart. He broke away from the Mu'tazilis and went on to become the founder of the Ash'ari school of theology in Islam. Basically, Asharism was a kind of compromise between the traditionists, who were rather literalistic and very heavily reliant on the text, and the Mu'tazilis, who were rationalist. Ashari school used rational methods to defend traditionist positions on things like God's attributes and tried to harmonize between the reports or hadiths or narrations which were on those issues and rational thought. The Ashari school became the dominant theological school in Islam over the last so many centuries. And in a sense, you could say that they had become the mainstream Islamic school of theology. But today, many Muslims wouldn't even know what an Ashari is. The ideas of Asharism are there in Muslim societies, but identification with the school is not that well known, particularly in countries like Australia, for example. Let us look at the issue of the clear and ambiguous in the Quran. The question for us is there a group of clear verses in the Quran that don't need any form of interpretation? Well, the short answer to that is not really. It is very hard to say these are the clear verses and these are the not so clear verses. A lot depends on your perspective or the school of thought you belong to. For example, the Mu'tazila disagreed with the traditionist view about whether you would see God in the afterlife. There are hadiths which say that the righteous believers will see God. The most elect of the people will be in the presence of God. They will look at Him, meaning look at God. They will see God. There is a Quranic verse which says, upon their Lord they are gazing. But the Mu'tazili's idea of God was that God was transcendent and beyond comprehension. God is not like anything you can see or perceive. So for the Mu'tazila, this verse was ambiguous. There is another verse which says, the eyes do not perceive him, meaning God. So for the Mu'tazila, this was a very clear verse, meaning the verse that says the eyes do not perceive him is a clear verse. But for the Ash'aris, it's not the case. For them, it is the very opposite. So the point is, a lot depends on which school of thought you belong to, and according to that, you would say that certain Quranic verses are clear, and for some other group, those very verses may seem not so clear. Let us look at the verse of the throne as an example of theology in interpretation. The verse of throne, or in Arabic, Ayatul Kursi, is chapter 2, verse 255. This verse is primarily about God's power. Now, let us look at how Quranic commentators try to interpret this verse, particularly the word kursi or throne. For the commentators, the difficulty was how to interpret the word kursi in this verse. Kursi in Arabic can be understood as the throne or the footstool, or in modern Arabic it means simply the chair. Commentators provided various meanings for this word kursi. One view is that God's kursi or throne or footstool encompasses the heavens and the earth. Tabari provides hadiths or reports or narrations trying to explain the meaning of this kursi. Let me just provide you with a sense of what Tabari is providing. There's one hadith that says, the Prophet said, the seven heavens in proportion to God's kursi are as 7 dirhams, that's coins, upon a metal shield. Ibn Abbas says this, the kursi is God's knowledge. And Tabari goes on to say that each of these accounts has its perspective and its teaching. Obviously, Tabari provides a number of these views, and then he says, well, each of them has its perspective. If we look at a Mu'tazili commentator on the Quran, we can look at Zamakhshari, died in 1144. He says there are 4 meanings for the word kursi, meaning God's kursi. But he says, but it is nothing but an imaginal portrayal of God's majesty and is only linguistic imagery. There is no actual chair, no act of sitting, and no sitter. That's a very Mu'tazili comment. An Ash'ari commentator on the Quran, Razi, says there are four views on the meaning of kursi. He says, in authentic reports, it is said that the kursi is a tremendous body beneath the arsh. Again, the Arabic word that is connected to kursi. And above the seventh heaven, there is no denying this report, and hence it is obligatory to follow it. What he's saying is there are some traditions or hadiths that tries to explain what the kursi is, and therefore we have to accept that hadith, which is authentic. Razi then goes on to say that God does not have limbs and organs, and God does not have a body. So reports that talk about God's feet should either be rejected or interpreted metaphorically. So being an Ash'ari scholar, Razi is saying that we have to accept the text or the tradition or the report. At the same time, we have to be careful in attributing certain things to God. And if we find such attribution, then we have to either say, well, this is not authentic, or this can be rejected, or we have to interpret the phrases metaphorically. As you can see, these commentators were struggling with a word that, if taken literally, it would be seen as attributing human qualities or things to God, such as kursi, chair, or throne, or sitting. Traditionalists would be happy to affirm those texts as long as they come in hadith, and Mu'tazilis would reject such attribution of human qualities and interpret such words or phrases metaphorically. Ash'aris would accept the authentic hadith if such a hadith is available, but give a non-literal meaning. Let's explore this issue of tradition versus reason in interpretation very briefly. Tradition versus reason is a key issue in Quranic interpretation. Of course, there's a huge body of traditions that try to explain the meaning of the Quran or various Quranic texts. Does it mean that nothing more can be said about the Quran because there are 38,000 or perhaps a lot more traditions or reports or narrations from the earliest Muslims about the meaning of the Quran? Does it mean that commentators basically have to defer to what Ibn Abbas or any other early authorities said as far as the meaning of the texts are concerned? And commentators cannot say anything about the meaning of the Quran at all. Is it the case? In practice, I would say that's not the case. Commentators continue to have lots of different ideas about the meaning of the Quranic texts. Among traditionists, there was a strong view that you must not speak about the Quran or say anything about the Quran unless you have a transmitted text that is a hadith or a report from the early period. This is what makes the traditionist a traditionist, because they don't want to consider anything other than the tradition. There is a narration or a report that again comes from Ibn Abbas, which says, the Prophet said, whoever speaks about the Quran according to his own opinion prepares himself a seat in the fire. How then do you respond to a hadith that doesn't suit you or poses a problem for you as far as Quranic interpretation is concerned? Let us just look at this hadith. One response adopted by some of the commentators on the Quran was that if you have a problem with some hadith, there are other hadiths that may help. So using those hadiths that do not seem to be problematic in interpreting is the way to go. So keep aside the hadiths that are in conflict with what you're doing. In the case of this hadith, which says, whoever speaks about the Quran according to his own opinion prepares himself a seat in the fire. There are other hadiths or reports that can clarify or explain the meaning of this hadith. Let's go back to Tabari again. Tabari quotes Ibn Abbas as saying the following. He says there are 4 types of text in the Quran. Some only can be understood by reference to the Prophet's words. For some texts, the meaning is only known to God. For some texts, they can be interpreted linguistically, meaning relying on linguistic analysis. For some texts, they are clearly known without any need for any kind of interpretation. So by just looking at the text. This leaves open the need for interpretation beyond what may be found in the hadith. So short answer is yes, one can interpret. The other way of looking at this is by simply interpreting the hadith that says XYZ. Now this is what Tabari says, and I quote, "It is not permitted for anyone to interpret according to his own personal opinion those verses of the Quran whose interpretation can only be known through a text, that is, reporting or explanation of God's messenger, or through an indication towards it which he has given." So the hadith that seems to be prohibiting any use of reason is not that broad. Its scope is narrower. Another scholar gives a rather narrower meaning for this hadith. Ibn Atiyah died 1147, who is also a commentator on the Quran, says, this hadith is more about when someone gives an interpretation according to his opinion, or rai in Arabic, without looking at what the ulama, that's the scholars, have said, and what is required by the rules of knowledge like grammar and the fundamentals of reason. I would say that this is probably the view of the majority of Quran commentators. For example, like figures like Qurtubi. Ghazali, the famous theologian, died 1111, makes it very clear. He says, the companions' views are not infallible. That is, their views on the interpretation of the Quran should not be considered as infallible. The Prophet did not teach interpretation of every single verse in the Quran. Then he goes on to say that grammar and logic are not personal opinion. So for Ghazali, there is room for interpretation using a vast array of tools, hadith, reports from companions and others, linguistic tools, logic, to name a few. So basically, even if there is a hadith that seems to suggest that reason cannot be used in interpretation, that hadith has been understood differently by different scholars and commentators on the Quran. The question is, do the ulama or the scholars have authority to interpret the Quran? The Muslim scholars or the ulama would say yes. But one of the very important and well-known scholars, Taymiyyah, who was famously known as a rather radical figure from the scholarly establishment, and his view was very traditionist. And he said that we shouldn't rely on grammar, logic, or theology in Quranic interpretation. For him, the Prophet taught his companions interpretation of the whole Quran. So we don't need to rely on such tools. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the Quran should be interpreted by relying on other verses of the Quran or with reference to hadith and the views of the earliest Muslims. Ibn Taymiyyah was a rather minority figure, but he had a very famous student whose name is Ibn Kathir, who wrote a commentary on the Quran, which is actually very popular now. At the time of Ibn Kathir and Ibn Taymiyyah, the Ibn Kathir's method was rather unusual because Ibn Kathir relied heavily on tradition, or primarily on tradition. He only used hadith and narrations or reports from early sources for his interpretation of the Quran. Also, he did try to sift out what he considered to be inauthentic traditions. This tafsir is very well known today and widely circulated around the world, in its English translation in particular. Now let us look at this issue of reason-based versus tradition-based interpretation. The issue is reason versus tradition in Quranic interpretation. The question is this a binary approach, the only way to look at interpretation, reason-based or tradition-based? The short answer is no. Interpretation is more complicated than that. Most interpreters relied on both tradition and reason. The issue was whether an interpreter's emphasis is on this or that. Someone like Tabari, for example, could be labeled as relying on tradition or reason, or both tradition and reason. In fact, most commentaries of the Quran would be a bit of both. In summary, both the early and classical eras of interpretation of the Quran saw the text being examined as word by word, phrase by phrase, and to really break the text down into small pieces to be analyzed individually, without looking at the verse in its social, historical, and other contexts. Perhaps this is something that has only emerged recently in the modern period, this emphasis on understanding the verse in its proper social, historical, political, legal, economic context. But this doesn't mean that this didn't exist in earlier times. It did exist, but the emphasis that we have on this in the modern period is probably a bit new. There was a use of rational, linguistic, and theological tools, but there were also questions about who was allowed to interpret the Quranic text. So we now look at the post-classical phase. From around the 1300 of the Common Era, we are looking at a post-classical phase. Interpretation becomes more about producing commentaries on commentaries of the classical period. So if you have a commentary by a classical scholar, someone from the post-classical phase would be quite comfortable in writing a commentary on that commentary, mostly on the margins of the original commentary. New ideas on Quranic interpretation became a lot less, and there was a degree of unoriginality. We will look at the modern period in another lecture. So in summary, this lecture was on interpretation of the Qur'an and how methods of interpretation have developed from the early centuries of Islamic history to the classical phase and then afterwards in the post-classical phase. We have asked why interpretation of the Qur'an was necessary in the first place, and then looked at some of the different approaches taken by different interpreters. We also looked at how commentators were influenced by different schools of thought and how they tackled issues like whether reason or tradition should be given more weight in interpretation. From this, I hope you've gained a sense that interpretation of the Quran is not always straightforward. It is a process. It is fluid. It accommodates vast array of views and opinions. There is no one single way to interpret. And it's a process that has changed throughout Islamic history and continues to change today. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more lectures in this series as we explore the Qur'an's history, themes, and interpretation, as well as related debates today. Subscribe and turn on notifications to catch the next lecture in the series.